Well, good morning, everyone. Good morning. I want to start by thanking Pastor Donnie for the invitation to speak. It's truly an honor and a privilege to be with you all this morning. Before I get into the teaching, I just want to give you some background on myself and the ministry work that I do. So, I'm a Messianic Jew, and that means that I'm a Jewish person who follows Jesus, the Messiah, and I express my faith in Jewish ways, living a Jewish life. Both my parents, they're Jewish, and they're actually the first ones in their families to follow Jesus as the Messiah. So I'm a second-generation Messianic Jew. They raised me and my siblings in a Messianic Jewish home where we learned to follow Jesus, who we called by his Hebrew name, Yeshua, while observing Jewish commandments and traditions. My faith walk following Jesus involved maintaining and holding on to my Jewish identity and practice. So what that meant is I grew up in going to a Messianic synagogue in Georgia. So on Shabbat, on Friday evenings or Saturday mornings, I would attend services, Shabbat services, a Jewish service with Jews and Gentiles expressing their faith in a way that worships God. It's as a Jewish community. So we would celebrate Jewish holidays like Sukkot, Shavuot, Rosh Hashanah, all these holidays, and Passover, and I was really involved in the community life. When I was 13, I had my bar mitzvah, and that's the Jewish coming-of-age ceremony, which is where I commit myself as a son of the commandment when I was 13 years old, and it was fun having classmates come in. I was attending a Christian school, so they could see what's this Jewish guy like at his home congregation. I'm grateful that my parents led me to faith at such a young age. Both my parents, they led me to faith in Jesus, and I committed my life to following him. And I could grow not only in my faith in Jesus, but also my Jewish identity in such a strong community. I want to tell you about something that happened the summer before I started college that really affected my life and my faith journey. So that summer, I was attending a conference, and at this conference, there was a speaker who was giving his testimony on how God had healed him from a severe spinal back injury. And I, at the time, was suffering from a chronic illness called ulcerative colitis. It's an intestinal disease that was plaguing me for 12 years, and modern medicine has no knowable cure. And so I went up, I said, I really need to talk to this man to ask him to pray for me, and because I saw how God healed him in his life. So I went up to him after his message, and I asked him if he would pray for me, and he did. And as he was praying, he said that God was, my intestines were being healed by God, and he ended his prayer putting his hand on me and loudly and boldly proclaiming that you are healed. And I was just overwhelmed with joy and gladness, and I told my sister, I was like, I'm healed, this is amazing, this is exactly what I wanted. But then minutes later, I discovered I wasn't. And that night, I lost my faith. I went outside on the campus where this conference was held, and I was just destroyed. I was like, I thought I was healed, and I wasn't. I thought God was real, and it seems like he's distant or not there. And so I felt angry and confused and lost, but then a thought entered into my head, and I couldn't deny this thought. And that is Yeshua, which is in Hebrew, Jesus. I said, Yeshua rose from the dead. Yeshua rose from the dead. Yeshua rose from the dead. That thought kept on repeating in my mind, and I said it audibly. And it wasn't because I felt God's presence in that moment. It was because I couldn't explain away the historical evidence that Jesus, in fact, bodily rose from the dead. I knew that Yeshua rose from the dead because I had studied that evidence. And that historical evidence, that truth, that historical fact, I was able to hold on to that, and it brought me back to faith in Jesus, following him as the Messiah. And that pushed me to really be a person who loves to pursue truth. So that's my attitude. I was just like on a quest to really I'm going to pursue truth. I know that Yeshua is the Messiah. I know Yeshua rose from the dead. I'm convinced that God exists, and I want to share that truth with others. So when I started college, I actually took it upon myself to put myself in challenging situations. First semester of college, I joined the Atheist Club, and as a believer, I saw an advertisement, and they would host these open debate discussions, and I would attend weekly to their meetings. And I was able to make really good friends through the club, and who were atheists, agnostics, and we would have these really fruitful conversations about whether or not God exists. And I would present my arguments, they would give their counter, and it was a lot of fun. And it was an opportunity to show non-believers that there are people who are convinced of these things because they know that it's true, and they have arguments and evidence that convince them that it's true. So I wanted to share that with them. I had conversations with Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses and Muslims and people of other religious faiths because I really was a person, and am still a person, who pursues truth and wants to be challenged because I know it stands the test of scrutiny. So later in college, I was at an event in which God instilled in me a strong desire to reach my people with the good news, my Jewish people. I felt very convicted that I was not bringing this good news of Yeshua, Jesus being the Messiah, to my own Jewish brothers and sisters. I was reaching all these other groups, but I was neglecting my own people. And so in that moment, I asked God to prepare me and to give me opportunities to share my faith with Jewish people. I thought about Paul, where Paul, when he's the apostle to the Gentiles, but even while he's on his missionary journeys to the Gentiles, he talks with Jews in the synagogue and showing them, reasoning from the scriptures, that Jesus is the Messiah. And so I was like, I really need to be a person who pursues my own people, to share the gospel with my own people. And so I asked God for opportunities, and He answered my prayer immediately. Right after I asked this prayer, I was at an event. Someone introduced me to this Jewish guy, Jewish graduate student, and we connected instantly and ended up having a 7-hour conversation on topics like the incarnation, the resurrection, Isaiah 53, all these things, from 10 p.m. to 5 in the morning, and it was great. But it was a moment in which God really impressed on me to share the good news with my Jewish people. So after I finished my master's degree, I went to Duke Divinity School. If you like Chapel Hill, I'm sorry, but hopefully you can stand listening to me still. But I joined staff with Chosen People Ministries in September of 22, and Chosen People Ministries, we are a 129-year-old mission to the Jewish people, and this is our mission statement. We exist to pray for, evangelize, disciple, and serve Jewish people and help fellow believers do the same. That's our mission. That's what motivates Chosen People Ministries. So I joined staff in 2022 and working in Chosen People Ministries' digital evangelism department, which is primarily involved in producing online content related to apologetics, the defense of our faith in Jesus. And the reason I do this is because my goal is to help Jewish people understand the message of Jesus the Messiah and address any misconceptions that may hinder their acceptance of his message. And Jewish people have a lot of misconceptions, a lot of roadblocks that stand in the way of them accepting the message of the gospel. So I do this by producing online content, which is so desperately needed right now, because religious Jews will, for the most part, maybe there's a rare exception, but for the most part, they're not going to enter into a church to hear the gospel. And religious Jews also have a very much closed community where they want to talk to their own people about these religious faith topics, so it's hard to hear the gospel from Christians. So if they have a question about Jesus or the New Testament, they're curious, it's not something you want to ask your rabbi about. So they go to a different rabbi, Rabbi Google, and going to ask their questions. So I want to meet Jewish people where they're at in an online format, because that's where they're asking their questions. And so that's what my ministry is primarily involved in. I do some on the ground work, hosting Bible studies for Jewish believers, but primarily it's involved in creating articles and online content that will help address the many objections and questions Jewish people have for accepting the gospel. I want to remove those roadblocks so they can hear the truth of Jesus being the Messiah. In Romans 1:16, we read this, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first, and also to the Greek." this passage where Paul says this statement, it really motivates my own ministry and chosen people ministries at large, where Paul says the gospel is to the Jew first. So that's where I want to start with. I want to help you understand where many Jewish people are coming from when the gospel is being presented to them, or Jesus' resurrection is being presented to them in particular. So I'll tell you a story. If you see that picture up there, that's a tent. Those are a couple tents that are set up in front of the largest Messianic Jewish conference in the world called Messiah Conference. This is held in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. And so at this conference, there'll be lots of Messianic Jews and also Christians who will attend. But these people in the tent are what's called counter-missionaries. I didn't say missionary, I said counter-missionaries. So they are Orthodox Jews who set up a tent, waving people in to come to the tent on their way to the campus so they can talk people like myself, Messianic Jews, out of their faith in Jesus, to kind of deconvert them. So they see this is a great opportunity to talk to Messianic Jews, so they don't go to the conference, but they wave people in trying to engage in conversation so they could, in their mind, come home to Judaism. They see me as someone who's departed. And they've been doing this for about 40 years. And I was presenting to the youth at the conference on the resurrection of Yeshua, the resurrection of Jesus, and how we know that indicates that Jesus is in fact the Messiah. So I was like, you know what, I'm going to go down to these tents and I want to talk to these counter-missionaries to see what are they going to say about the evidence for the resurrection? What are they going to think? Because I want to test out the arguments. I pursue and want to know what's true. And so I went down to the tent, and you'll see the one rabbi there waving. His name is Rabbi Yisrael Blumenthal. You can find him. He's on YouTube. He has lots of content out there for an organization called Jews for Judaism. But he said, what do you want to talk about? And I said, I want to talk about the resurrection of Jesus. And he says, perfect. But let me tell you something. Even if I was convinced, this is Blumenthal speaking, he says, even if I was convinced that Jesus rose from the dead, even if Jesus was standing right in front of me, I still wouldn't believe he's the Messiah. So you can talk about it, but I'm not going to believe he's the Messiah. And why did he say that? He told me. He said the reason is because there's a text in the Torah that says that false prophets are going to come, perform miracles as a way to lead Israel astray. And the reason false prophets can perform miracles is because God is testing Israel, the Jewish people. And so for Rabbi Blumenthal, the resurrection would just be a test from God to see whether he would be faithful to God rather than following and worshiping a false Messiah. That's what he said to me. And I had no idea what to do. I had no idea what to say. I was stumped. And I talked about the evidence for the resurrection, the historical evidence, but I didn't go to it meaning Yeshua is the Messiah because I didn't know what to do. But after that conversation, I really took it upon myself to study this out, to understand Deuteronomy 13, understand Jesus' resurrection, and to provide an answer that is satisfied, that I'm satisfied with personally, because it's important to know that Yeshua is the Messiah. It's core to the gospel. The resurrection is core to the gospel. To help you understand more where Jewish people are coming from, when I was in college, I hosted a debate between two speakers. One's Dr. Michael Brown, and the other is Rabbi Daniel Freitag. So Rabbi Freitag is a local Orthodox rabbi. Dr. Brown is a Jewish apologist and scholar, Messianic Jewish, so he believes in Jesus. And so they're debating the topic, is Jesus the Messiah? And Rabbi Freitag responded to Dr. Brown's case with only one point. He only had one point to say Jesus is not the Messiah. And his point was, the Torah teaches that Jewish people are not supposed to listen to anyone who tells Jewish people they no longer have a responsibility to keep the commandments. And so he views the gospel as telling him as a Jew that he no longer has this expectation to keep the commandments, like Shabbat and other areas. So he says this in the debate, I wrote it down. All I need is for there to be one place in this book, speaking of the Old Testament or the Tanakh, one, just once anywhere, first-person statement to me from God that says, Dear Jew, I changed my mind. No longer shall you keep the commandments, for the Messiah will come, and through his death you will no longer need to keep the commandments. I want to help you understand where Rabbi Freitag is coming from. the Torah teaches that Israel, the Jewish people, are expected to keep the commandments. There's not this expectation on all people, not on Gentiles, but for Jewish people, the Torah gives this expectation. And so from Rabbi Freitag's understanding, he thinks the gospel teaches that if he follows Jesus as the Messiah, he's no longer going to be Jewish anymore, because he will no longer have this expectation to follow God's commandments. It's like God gave Israel, the Jewish people, a gift, and he's thinking the gospel says, I'm taking that away. And so he sees the Deuteronomy 13 as another example of this. If someone comes to you, they give a miracle, and they tell you to tell Israel, the Jewish people, to stop keeping the commandments, don't listen to them. They're a false prophet. And so this is where he's coming from as a rabbi, and where a lot of Jewish people are coming from, where they have this misunderstanding of the gospel. So I'm coupling those two things together to help you understand where my Jewish people are coming from. So let's look at the text that Rabbi Blumenthal cited, that the rabbi I went to the tent and talked with. So it's right here in Deuteronomy 13. If a prophet or a dreamer of dreams arises among you and gives you a sign or a wonder, and the sign or wonder that comes true, of which he spoke to you, saying, let us follow other gods whom you have not known, and let's serve them, you shall not listen to the words of that prophet or dreamer of dreams, for the Lord your God is testing you, to find out whether you love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul. You shall follow the Lord your God and fear him, and you shall keep his commandments, listen to his voice, serve him, and cling to him. But that prophet or that dreamer of dreams shall be put to death, because he has spoken falsely against the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, and redeemed you from the house of slavery, to drive you from the way in which the Lord your God commanded you to walk. So you shall eliminate evil from among you. So right here, we're reading in the text that God tests Israel, and the way he's testing them is there's these false prophets who were performing miracles, leading Israel astray. So the first question I want to ask the text is, why would a false prophet use a miraculous sign to lead Israel astray? Like, why would they do that in the first place? Well, to answer this question, we need to look at what the Torah says about how we can know whether we can identify someone as a true prophet. So what does the Torah have to say about this? Let's go to Exodus. So in Exodus 3, this is where God appears to Moses through the burning bush, and he commissions Moses as a prophet to lead the children of Israel out of Egypt. And in that moment, you see in Exodus 4 that Moses is resistant. He argues with God, saying, "Don't pick me. They're not going to listen to me." Right? Moses is saying, "They're not going to listen to me. Why would anyone listen to me, the people of Israel?" And so in response to this, God provides Moses with 3 miraculous signs when he appears to him. We read in the text, "Then Moses said, 'What if they will not believe me or listen to me, to what I say? For they may say, the Lord has not appeared to you.' The Lord said to him, 'What is that in your hand?' And he said, 'A staff.' Then he said, 'Throw it on the ground.' So he threw it on the ground, and it turned into a serpent. And Moses fled from it. But the Lord said to Moses, 'Reach out your hand and grasp it by its tail.' So he reached out with his hand and caught it, and it turned into a staff in his hand." And then here's the key. "So that they may believe that the Lord, the God of their fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has appeared to you." So these miraculous signs, these miracles, were intended to validate Moses as a true prophet before Israel, to convince the Jewish people enslaved in Egypt that Moses was truly a prophet sent by God. We go on in the text in Exodus 4, and Moses told Aaron all the words of the Lord with which he had sent him, and all the signs that he had commanded him to do. So he's providing the words of the Lord, and then he follows it up by providing signs. It says, "Then Moses and Aaron went and assembled all the elders of the sons of Israel, and Aaron spoke all the words which the Lord had spoken to Moses. He then performed the signs in the sight of the people, so the people believed." The reason the elders of Israel are convinced that Moses was a true prophet is because God validated him through these miraculous signs. And we see throughout the story of the Exodus, when you read about the 10 plagues of Egypt, right? When God brings those plagues on Egypt through Moses, the turning the Nile River into blood, and we see darkness and all these different plagues that take place, you see how God continuously is validating Moses as a true prophet. You get to the last plague, the death of the firstborn, and when the death of the firstborn takes place, Pharaoh is like, get out of here, okay? He tells the Jewish people to leave. The Israelites, get out of here and go, and yeah, you can go free. I can't take it anymore. So they leave, Israelites leave, and they come in contact with the Red Sea. And so what do? There's this blockage. How are they going to get past it? Well, Moses raises his rod, and the sea splits. It's this epic moment in Israel's history where the Red Sea splits, and the people can go cross it through it on dry ground. They get to the other side, and then the Egyptian army is coming from behind. And so the Israelites are like looking back, and they're like, oh, they're coming to get us. What are we going to do? And what happens is Moses raises his rod, and the sea comes crashing on the Egyptian army. And we actually see the people's response in Exodus 14:31. And when Israel saw the great power which the Lord had used against the Egyptians, the people feared the Lord, and they believed in the Lord and in his servant Moses. The reason the people of Israel are convinced that Moses is a true prophet, that they could believe, is because they witnessed with their own eyes and walking through on dry ground that God had validated Moses through these miraculous signs. We see this throughout the Old Testament, throughout what when Jewish people call the Tanakh. 1 Kings 18, right, for example, with Elijah and the prophets of Baal, when there's this really epic showdown. I mean, read 1 Kings 18. It's a really awesome text. And you see that these 450 prophets of Baal and challenge Elijah to this. There's this challenge between Elijah and these false prophets, and the test to whether whose God is the true God and whose prophet is a true prophet is whoever receives fire from heaven on their offering. And so, of course, the prophets of Baal, they try and no fire comes down on their offering. They start cutting themselves and doing all these rituals, and they still receive no fire. But then when it's Elijah's turn, he makes the scene. He has a new altar built. He has a moat built around it. He pours water all over his sacrifice so that it'll be really known who the God of Israel is. And then he says, Lord God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, today let it be known that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant, and that I have done all these things at your word. Answer me, Lord, answer me, so that this people may know that you, Lord, are God, and that you have turned their heart back. And then fire falls from heaven. It consumes the offering, the wood, the stone. It licks up all the water that's in the ditch. And the people fall on their faces, and they say, the Lord, he is God. The Lord, he is God. And then Elijah seizes the false prophets and has them slaughtered. So, consistent with Deuteronomy 13, Elijah provides a sign to justify his status as a true prophet and to bring Israel back to the worship of the true God. So this is the point we get. We get that God validates true prophets through miracles. We see many more examples in the Old Testament. And this helps explain why a false prophet would use miracles to lead Israel astray. What they're doing is they're mimicking the real thing. They're trying to show Israel that they are a true prophet because they know how God validates true prophets. Okay, so then how can Israel distinguish between a true prophet and a false prophet if they both produce miracles? Like, how are we going to answer this question? Because they're both producing miracles, so what other test is there to know whether they're a true prophet? Well, let's read the text again. And I put some highlighted points in yellow there because I want to bring something out here. So someone claims to be a prophet, but the text says, and they provide a miracle to justify their status, but then the text says that if they say, let's follow other gods and let's serve them, you shall not listen to the words of that prophet or that dreamer of dreams. The reason is because God is testing Israel to see whether Israel love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul. You shall follow the Lord your God and fear him and keep his commandments. The reason the false prophet is doing this, providing these miracles, is because this false prophet is trying to drive Israel away from the way in which the Lord your God commanded you to walk. It comes down to evaluating the teaching of the one claiming to be a prophet. It's not enough just to have a miracle. The only way you can know whether their miracle is validating is by evaluating the teaching of that person, if it's consistent with the Torah, if it's affirming the Torah. And the reason you see here it's all about obedience to the commandments when it comes to Israel, the Jewish people, is because when you read the Torah, you see that Israel expresses their love towards God through obedience, and specifically to the commandments that God gifted Israel. After God redeemed Israel, he gave them the commandments. It's a gracious act. And so the phrase there, love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul, this is a callback to Deuteronomy 6 from the Shema and the V'ahavta, which is Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And it goes on, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength, right? And this is what Israel is supposed to do. And that false prophet is leading them away from that way of life, obedience to God. So how do false prophets perform signs and wonders? Like how are they doing it, right? Well, we actually can find an answer to this question in Matthew. So in Matthew chapter 12, this is, to give you some context, Jesus is participating, he's in a ministry of healings and exorcisms. And he's in a situation in which a demon-oppressed man who's blind and mute is brought to Jesus. And there's a Jewish crowd around. And we read in Matthew 12, 22 through 24, that Yeshua healed him so that the man who was unable to speak talked and could see. And all the crowds were amazed and were saying, "This man cannot be the son of David, can he?" But when the Pharisees heard this, they said, "This man casts out demons only by Beelzebul, the ruler of demons." So what's going on here? This Jewish crowd recognizes that Jesus may be the Messiah, the son of David, that Davidic Messiah, that Davidic king who is promised in the Old Testament. And so, because they saw his miracles, they recognized the significance of his miracles. But then there were a group of Pharisees there who said that Jesus only does this because he's using demonic power. So they're not denying that Jesus is doing miracles. They're saying the source of power for his miracles is not coming from God, it's coming from demons, the prince of demons, Beelzebul. So not all miracles come from God. This is really helpful when we're assessing Deuteronomy 13, because right here, these Pharisees here, this group of Pharisees, are accusing Jesus of being a false prophet using demonic power to produce miracles to lead Israel astray. When I was looking into Deuteronomy 13 and assessing this argument, assessing this objection that was posed to me by this rabbi when it comes to saying that Jesus' resurrection does not indicate he's Messiah, I've actually found a Jewish thinker to be really helpful to understand Deuteronomy 13. This is Maimonides. He's a 12th century Jewish philosopher, and he's very well respected and known within the Jewish community. He's not a follower of Jesus. He really had he thought Jesus was a false prophet, actually. But you can find grains of truth even with those you disagree with. And that's what I did with Maimonides. And so I think he's helpful here when he wrote this in his letter to an oppressed Jewish community in Yemen, when he writes, "We are enjoined to yield obedience to one who asserts that he is a prophet, provided he can substantiate his claim by miracle or proofs. Although there is a possibility that he is an impostor, however, if the would-be prophet teaches tenets that negate the doctrines of Moses, then we must repudiate him." Right there, Maimonides is recognizing that God validates true prophets through miracles, but you have to evaluate the teachings of the one claiming to be a prophet. He goes on to write, in a very well-known book within the Jewish community called Mishnah Torah, he says, "Since he, a false prophet, seeks to discredit the teaching of Moses, we know for certain that he is a false prophet, and whatever he did was done by secret arts and with the aid of witchcraft." So right there we see that if the person claiming to be a prophet teaches against Torah, then Israel knows that that miracle was not empowered by God, it was empowered by something else, some other source. I kind of made a flow chart here to kind of help explain and see the order of the sequence of order right here. So someone comes to Israel and they claim to be a prophet, they produce a miraculous sign, but then they tell Israel to follow other gods. They tell Israel to go away from the commandments that God gave them. Well, that teaching indicates that their sign was empowered by something other than God. Someone claims to be a prophet, they produce a miracle, and they affirm the Torah. They affirm all this. That teaching indicates their sign was empowered by God. It comes down to the teaching and the one behind the sign. An example of someone using demonic power or other power to produce miracles is found in Exodus again, Exodus 7. Verse 22, but the soothsayer priests of Egypt did the same with their secret arts, meaning they were turning water into blood, like Moses turned the Nile River into blood. But the soothsayer priests of Egypt did the same with their secret arts, and Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and he did not listen to them, just as the Lord had said. They're using a power other than God to produce these miracles. Okay, so now we have to ask the question, would God validate a false prophet? Okay, because what this rabbi was telling me is that the reason Jesus rose from the dead is because it was just God testing Israel. So would God validate a false prophet by resurrecting him from the dead? I don't think so, and here's why. Using Deuteronomy to interpret Deuteronomy. In Deuteronomy 18, this is the second text that talks about identifying true and false prophets. In Deuteronomy 18, we read here, and if you say in your heart, how will we recognize the word which the Lord has not spoken? When the prophet speaks in the name of the Lord, and the thing does not happen or come true, that is a thing which the Lord has not spoken. The prophet has spoken it presumptuously. You are not to be afraid of him. So what does this tell us? Well, this tells us that God would not fulfill the prophecy of a false prophet, and therefore would not validate the claim of a false prophet by empowering their miracle. God's not going to do that. He would not fulfill the prophecy of a false prophet, and therefore he would not validate the claim of a false prophet by empowering their miracle. So in what way is God testing Israel then? Like, how is God testing Israel? I did some digging on this and looking at the way different Jewish interpreters have understood Deuteronomy 13 and this test. And I found probably the most credible answer is that it's a test because God is allowing the false prophet to live. Right? So it's the false prophet is using a miracle, using demonic power, or whatever they're using, sleight of hand, or whatever kind of miracle they're producing, to lead Israel astray. And instead of God striking them down dead so they can't do that, he's allowing them to live. Here's a modern Jewish scholar making this exact point very succinctly. He says, the Lord is testing you by allowing the sign to come true. And notice that word allowing, that's different than empowering. Right? God is allowing the sign to come true. He's not empowering the false prophet to do these things. I was in a conversation with a counter missionary just last summer making this exact point, and he actually said that, yes, God allows false prophets to produce miracles. And I'm like, exactly. That's different than empowering them to do so. And I brought up this Deuteronomy 18 as an example of why it cannot be empowering. And this rabbi said, yeah, I don't know what to do with that. It was a great moment because he's a counter missionary who does this for a living, and he saw the strength of this kind of argument. So here's some key points to draw from what we've covered so far. Signs that derive from God's power validate true prophets. God would not validate a false prophet, and God tests Israel by allowing false prophets to perform miraculous signs. Okay, so that is the data we have as we're looking at the resurrection of Jesus. So let's go to Matthew 12. Back to Matthew 12. So when you get home or sometime later this week, go back and read Matthew 12 and see how Jesus responds to the claim that he's using demonic power to exorcise demons. It's a really cool response you see in the text. But some of the Pharisees and scribes now are joining. They're not convinced, and they think Jesus is still a false prophet of Deuteronomy 13, using miracles to lead Israel astray. They say, "Teacher, we want to see a sign from you." And we know here that they're continuing to accuse Jesus of being a false prophet in Deuteronomy 13. One reason being because that Greek word for sign is semeion, and it's the same Greek word that's used in the Greek translation of Deuteronomy 13, the sign the false prophet does to lead Israel astray. And so what they're doing there is they're saying, oh, yeah, whatever sign you give, we're not going to accept it because we know that false prophets use miracles to lead Israel astray. So what do you got? And so Yeshua, Jesus, gives a powerful response. He says, an evil and adulterous generation craves a sign, and so no sign will be given to it except the sign of Jonah the prophet. For just as Jonah was in the stomach of the sea monster for 3 days and 3 nights, so will the Son of Man be in the heart of the earth for 3 days and 3 nights. What Jesus is saying here is that if you go through with Deuteronomy 13, what it prescribes, you send me to the Jewish leaders, and those Jewish leaders send me to Rome to be executed as a false prophet, then my sign is actually going to be my resurrection from the dead. Think about it. Dead false prophets stay dead, right? So what Jesus does is he actually appeals to a miracle. He appeals to a sign that only God has the power to do, resurrection. We see that in the Torah, in Deuteronomy 32:39. See now that I am he, there is no God besides me. It is I who put to death and give life. 1 Samuel 2:1 and 6. Indeed, there is no one besides you, nor is there any rock like our God. The Lord puts to death and makes alive. He brings down to Sheol and brings up. In Ezekiel 37, this is the vision that Ezekiel has of the valley of dry bones, representing the whole house of Israel. This is a prophecy of Israel's restoration back to the land of Israel. And in this prophecy, we see language of resurrection. We read here, and he said to me, Son of man, speaking to Ezekiel, can these bones live? And I answered, Lord God, you yourself know. Meaning, God is the only one who raises the dead. He's the only one who knows if these bones can live. And then he says, then you will know that I am the Lord when I have opened your graves and caused you to come out of your graves, my people. And I will put my spirit within you, and you will come to life. And I will place you on your own land. Then you will know that I, the Lord, have spoken and done it, declares the Lord. Why this is so significant is because Israel, the prediction here, this prophecy is that Israel will know the Lord's identity by witnessing his unique power to resurrect the dead. We don't need to read through these texts, but in rabbinic literature, in both the Jerusalem Talmud and the Babylonian Talmud, these are key texts within Judaism today and have been for centuries. And in both of those texts, there are affirmations that only God has the power to resurrect the dead. There's an interpretation of 1 Samuel 2:6 right here from Jerusalem Talmud, Sanhedrin 10:2. There is no one who raises the dead except for the Holy One, blessed be he, meaning only God has that power. It's not just in these extra-biblical writings, it's not just in the Torah, it's not just in the Tanakh as a whole, the Old Testament, but even in Jewish prayers that have been prayed for centuries, and also still today, this affirmation of God's exclusive power is still mentioned. So there's a prayer called the Amidah. It's a long prayer, and it's prayed by religious Jews 3 times a day. In the morning, in the afternoon, and the evening. And there's a certain section of the prayer called the Gevarot, which is praising God for God's might and his exclusive power to resurrect the dead. Jewish people all over have already prayed this morning. And in that prayer, this is what it says. You are mighty forever, O Lord. You revive the dead. Who is like you, master of mighty deeds? Who can be compared to you, O King, who causes death and restores life and causes your salvation to sprout? You are faithful to restore the dead to life. Blessed are you, O Lord, who brings life to the dead. Like a beating drum, it just continues, this prayer continues to praise God for God's exclusive power to resurrect the dead. So in talking with a Jewish person, this is not a debatable point. It's not like a controversial point. If they are an Orthodox Jew, they know this is something only God does. They've been praying it for years, 3 times a day. So we can kind of summarize this argument like this. Jesus claimed his messianic identity, his claiming to be the Messiah, would be validated through the sign of his resurrection. Signs that derive from God's power validate true prophets. God would not validate a false prophet. Jesus rose from the dead. Only God raises the dead. Therefore, Jesus is the Messiah. The resurrection is God identifying Jesus as the Messiah. And if this sounds like a new argument, it's really a reformulation of an old argument. Because we read in Acts chapter 2, this is when Peter was in Jerusalem, in the temple, on the feast of Shavuot, or it's often other times called as Pentecost. This is 50 days after Passover. And so Jewish people from all over would come to Jerusalem to celebrate this festival. And so Peter has an audience of people from all these different surrounding nations who are Jewish. And he tells them, he says, "Men of Israel, listen to these words. Jesus the Nazarene, a man attested to you by God with miracles and wonders and signs which God performed through him in your midst, just as you yourselves know." Notice there the language of God behind Jesus' miracles. He says, "This man delivered over by the predetermined plan and foreknowledge of God, you nailed to a cross by the hands of godless men and put him to death." Meaning that you thought he was a false prophet. You thought he was a false prophet, and so you had him put to death. Through the religious leaders, the Jewish leaders had him put to death by Rome. It is this Jesus whom God raised up. See, God raised up. A fact to which we are all witnesses. He's saying, Peter, he's saying himself, and the other disciples are witnesses of the risen Jesus. They ate and drank with him. He appeared for over 40 days, as Luke tells us. And then in verse 36, Peter says, "Therefore let all the house of Israel know assuredly that God has made him both Lord and Messiah, this Jesus whom you crucified." The resurrection is the identification of Jesus' divine and messianic identity. Jesus is Lord and Messiah. So here's the objection, to kind of summarize the objection back from the beginning. Jesus cannot be the Messiah because he's a false prophet according to Deuteronomy 13. Here's the response. Deuteronomy 13 helps us see that Jesus' resurrection is God's validation that Jesus is the Messiah who taught Jewish people to be faithful, to live in obedience to the commandments. And why do I add that line there? Well, see where Rabbi Freitag is coming from, where a lot of Jewish people are coming from. They think that Jesus is leading them as a Jew, as Jewish people, away from being faithful to the commandments that God gave them. And so the issue is that the false prophet is doing that. The false prophet using miracles is leading Israel away from those commandments. But by raising Yeshua, Jesus, from the dead, that means the opposite is true. That means that Jesus is one who taught faithfulness of Jewish people to keep those commandments. If you go to Mark 12, if the question is asked, well, where does Jesus teach this? Mark 12, verse 28 through 31. One of the scribes came up and heard them arguing, and recognizing that Jesus had answered them well, he asked him, "What commandment is the foremost of all?" So they're recognizing Jesus as a good rabbi, and they're like, okay, so what's the foremost commandment? He doesn't there tell these Jewish people that, oh yeah, you don't have to keep any of the commandments. I'm going to teach you to follow another God. His name's Baal. He doesn't do that. He says the foremost is Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. And you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind and with all your strength. The second is this, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. There is no other commandment greater than these. Remember, in Deuteronomy 13, the false prophet is leading Israel away from their love towards God. God tests Israel to see whether they will love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul. And so what Jesus does here is he's actually saying that the greatest commandment is to love God with all your heart and with all your soul, with all your mind, with all your strength. Jesus does not fail the Deuteronomy 13 test. Instead, Jesus upholds the Torah. He recites that Shema prayer, affirms that God alone is to be worshipped, and in line with other Jewish thinkers, he actually cites Leviticus 19:18, affirming that love is the substance of the Torah. So the resurrection is God identifying Jesus as the Messiah, and it's also a pronouncement of Yeshua's teaching regarding Jewish people's faithfulness to the commandments. There's a idea that is out there, and I think it's true, that many Jewish people don't believe that Jesus rose from the dead. And yes, if Jewish people who don't believe that Jesus is the Messiah will almost always believe that Jesus did not rise from the dead. I happen to know an exception personally, but this is the general view. So there's this book right here. It's by Dr. Pinchas Lapid, and he became the first Jewish scholar to publish a full-length book on Jesus' resurrection. He's an Orthodox Jew, the late Pinchas Lapid. And so before writing this book, he was actually convinced that Jesus did not rise from the dead. But he examined the evidence, and the evidence convinced him that God raised Jesus from the dead. And he didn't just say this, he didn't just keep this to himself. He was willing to publish this as a book, and it was translated into English. So one quote from the book, he says, "I accept the resurrection of Jesus not as an invention of the community of disciples, but as a historical event." It's just so powerful because the reason why I think this is so important is because if I'm talking to a Jewish person and we're able to get to the point where we're saying, okay, well, did he rise from the dead? I'd rather not give my own arguments. I'd rather give Dr. Lapid's arguments and say, what do you think of his arguments? What do you think of what he said regarding why he thinks Jesus rose from the dead? As I mentioned at the beginning, the resurrection is core to the gospel. In 2 Timothy 2:8, Paul is giving his really one-line summary of the gospel. If you want the gospel in one summary line, go to 2 Timothy 2:8. Remember, Jesus, Messiah, risen from the dead, descendant of David according to my gospel. And this gospel, as I'm talking about Jewish people, I want you to understand that there's this understanding within this Jewish community that the gospel is foreign to the Jewish people. This is a Christian idea that is not compatible with Judaism. But the gospel that Paul is proclaiming, the gospel that's preached in the New Testament, that Yeshua, Jesus, brought, is one that we already find in the book of Isaiah, in the Old Testament, in the prophets. Isaiah 52:7-10. How delightful on the mountains are the feet of one who brings good news, who announces peace and brings good news of happiness, who announces salvation and says to Zion, your God reigns. Listen, your watchmen, raise their voices. They shout joyfully together, for they will see with their own eyes when the Lord restores Zion. Be cheerful, shout joyfully together, you ruins of Jerusalem, for the Lord has comforted his people. He has redeemed Jerusalem. The Lord has bared his holy arm in the sight of all the nations, so that all of the ends of the earth may see the salvation of our God. Right there, Isaiah is speaking of the gospel, this good news. And the good news is that the Lord is returning to Zion. Who is the Lord returning to Zion? Jesus, Yeshua. He is the Lord returning to Zion. And I just had to add this one point here. When it says, brings good news of happiness, who announces salvation, that word salvation is actually Yeshua. Right there in Isaiah 52, the Hebrew name, a form of the Hebrew name we have for that comes to the name Jesus. So Yeshua, Jesus, is the Lord who came to save the Jewish people and the rest of the world. This is the good news. And what I want you all to take away from this is just kind of a motivation to bring the gospel to Jewish people. I read it at the beginning, but I'll read it again, where Paul says, for I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first, and also to the Greek. Romans 10:1, brothers and sisters, my heart's desire and prayer to God is for them, for Israel, is for their salvation. Romans 11:1-2, I say, then, God has not rejected his people, has he? Far from it. For I, too, am an Israelite, Paul speaking here, a descendant of Abraham, of the tribe of Benjamin. God has not rejected his people whom he foreknew. And in Romans 11:26, and so all Israel will be saved. This is what we see repeated throughout Paul's writings, is this salvation of the Jewish people. God has not rejected his people. His Jewish people will all be saved. So, I want you to be in prayer for Jewish people, for their salvation. There's so many who need to hear the good news, who need to hear in a way that doesn't tell them that they need to stop being Jewish, that they can and should remain Jewish, following Jesus, the Jewish Messiah. So please be praying for them. Pray for opportunities. If you see a Jewish person that come around the area, that would be awesome. Engage in conversation and let them feel loved, especially now, because right now we're living in a time where there's an increasing rise in anti-Semitism, and it really means a whole lot when Christians are able to and do say, I stand with you, I stand with Israel. So please even express that. If you have a Jewish friend, express that and say, I'm here for you, I stand with Israel, I stand with the Jewish people. and ask God for opportunities to share the message with them. Also, please be praying for my ministry with Chosen People Ministries apologetics department, this digital evangelism department, because my goal is to be a resource for Jewish people who are seeking answers to their questions about Jesus and the New Testament. It's a form of outreach that is adapted to today, to meet Jewish people in a unique way online. So I don't want my people to dismiss Jesus for the wrong reasons. There's a lot of reasons in which Jewish people don't accept Jesus, and I want to eliminate those reasons, show why those reasons aren't good. I want to see Jewish people come to know Jesus the Messiah. And so I'm part of a team that produces this online content addressing their unique Jewish questions and objections. I want to show them, as Jewish people, that the teachings in the New Testament are both Jewish and they're true. So this is my goal. So, as Pastor Donnie mentioned at the beginning, I do have one book out here. This is by the president of Chosen People Ministries, Dr. Mitch Glazer, Isaiah 53 Explained. And I'd just love to give you this book as a gift. For those of you who are willing to sign up to receive my monthly prayer letter, so you can be praying for the unique ways I'm doing ministry, and just to keep up in prayer and to keep you informed of just the ministry life and what I'm doing. I'm also, I just am really starting out with Chosen People Ministries, so if anyone of you feels led by the Lord to join the team of people who are partnering with me in ministry to support me financially on a monthly basis, I pray blessings on you, and it would bless me as well. I just want to thank you all for allowing me to come and to share this message of the resurrection. It's had a huge impact on my life. It preserved my faith in Jesus and Yeshua and pushed me forward. And I want that message to spread to Jewish people as well. So I pray that God blesses your community here and gives you the opportunities to bring the gospel to Jewish people. So thank you all.